Hi, everyone. We welcome you to this book discussion on the public and their platforms, Public Sociology in an Era of Social Media with Mark Carrigan and Lambros Fatsis. Lambros is a senior lecturer in criminology within the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Brighton and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Mark Carrigan is a lecturer in education at the University of Manchester. He directs the post-pandemic university project, which is an international network comprising an online magazine, podcast hub, and conference series. The recent book, The Public and the Platforms, explore the implications of digital platforms and emerging technologies for public scholarship. A very warm welcome, Lambros and Mark, to Doing Sociology, and we're very glad to have you both here with us today. So I'll begin with this question. Let's talk about what your understanding of public sociology is, and also, do you think the meaning of public sociology has changed since the term was first used by Michael Burawoy?
So yeah, I mean, I first of all, thanks for inviting us and for having this conversation with us, which I don't know about you, but it's about, especially because we don't get that many opportunities to connect with with people even within the UK, with colleagues within the UK, let alone colleagues from further afield. So I really treasure this opportunity. But I guess in to answer your question, I think our understanding of public sociology comes in two versions, where the first relates to what we understand the term to mean, based on how it is used by others, Burawoy included. And I guess the second relates to how we understand it in terms of what we, as in the two of us, mean by it and how we use the term. So I guess the conventional conception of the term essentially refers to sociological scholarship that is disseminated in the public sphere. So in that sense, public sociology claims to raise or address issues of public relevance and strives or hopes to share such insights with the public. But I think the version that Mark and I have in mind differs quite substantially from that. And I think the way we approach public sociology is by envisaging it as something that sociologists do in public rather than to public. So we do not use public sociology, for example, as a synonym of participatory citizenship. But rather what we try to do is look at what is uniquely sociological about participation in public life. And what we identify is a capacity to use sociology as something that can be taught, for example, in community education projects, and as a way of thinking that can be relied on to build such projects in the first place. So an example I have in mind, and which we discuss in the book, is one that I have personally been involved with for 9 years now, which is Free University Brighton. And this was launched by a group of academics, mostly sociologists, in fact, who created a community education project that offers university level education for free, so free of charge, in response to a trebling of tuition fees in the UK in 2010. So this for us is an example of public sociology, as teaching material, but also and essentially that's what makes it sociological, right? It's specifically sociological education. But it's also public because it is done in public and with publics rather than to publics. So teaching sociology in that manner, in projects that develop out of sociological scholarship as public interventions, combine a function that is in part sociological education, but also a public dialogue and I guess conducting a sociological education in a way that goes beyond the traditional, let's say, lecturing format. It's more of a discussion. It's more about what learners want to learn, as well as what we can provide or what we had in mind to talk about. Now, in terms of how Burawoy, I think, conceives of the project, or rather whether whether it has changed since Borowoy popularized the term, I don't think it has changed. And while there are variations on the same theme, I don't think I think the main interpretation of public sociology hasn't really changed. So it continues to be thought of as something that sociologists do to their audiences, be it through, you know, opinion pieces or interviews or podcasts or the use of social media, blogging, etc. So in many ways, I think it's not it's not surprising, as it's a, you know, it's a fancy and it's a flattering term, particularly because one can use it to label oneself as a public sociologist simply by, you know, writing the odd article here and there that is not an academic article. And I don't think that suffices to call such activities public, nor do I think that they, you know, that they create much of a public life, to be honest. So I guess this is my attempt at answering, you know, a very interesting and complicated question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of framing it, Lambros, and I think that captures a lot of the project. And it made me think back to what motivated me to want to work on this book with you in like the earlier stages. And I think there's also a frustration that I felt with this kind of idiomatic use of public sociology, which I think is very common in British sociology for reasons specific to British sociology, where public sociology as a label becomes a kind of placeholder for sociologists doing activism, which is how I got drawn into the debate about public sociology and why I became interested in it. But also the schism that suggests between this very voluminous literature and the imprecise ways in which the term was used. And not that I think is necessarily a good thing if we insist everything becomes precise, but just that lack of precision meant there wasn't really an examination of the kind of things we're trying to examine in the book. And I think you wrote in our introduction that, you know, this project is an attempt to throw things up in the air. And in that sense, you know, we don't want to give up on the public sociology debate, but I think it's fair to say we were both frustrated with it, that it's not really been going anywhere. There's been this divide between theory and practice, and there's been a failure to engage with new technologies. And we're not trying to offer a kind of systematic account, but we're trying to, as you put it, throw everything in the air, just to kind of restart the debate, to show how we could move the pieces around and hopefully get a more productive conversation going. Whether we've achieved that or not is something for other people to judge. But I think it was a very earnest attempt on both our parts to try and inject some new life into this debate, because it's important, but it's also been going wrong for a whole host of reasons.
Right. And since as someone who has read the book, I can say that, you know, you've also argued how contemporary interactions between the discipline of sociology, publics, and then social media platforms sort of demand a new understanding of public sociology, as your opening answers also show. So could you talk about this with some specific examples, you know?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work prior to the book was about social media in higher education. And this was why I was so enthusiastic about social media, because I saw it as such a powerful means of doing public sociology. And my contributions to the book were in part grappling with all the inadequacies of social media for these purposes. So I came into it through the development of a blogging project, the Sociological Imagination, which was a popular sociology blog between 2010 and 2017. And I find it really interesting to look back on the motivations behind that in retrospect, because there were so many assumptions built into it, which I've since tried to critically examine. And Lambros and I have talked about, amongst other things. The idea that actually the only problem was getting sociological knowledge out to the world, that the only problem was paywalls on journals. And don't get me wrong, I think paywalls and journals are a huge problem and reflect a fundamentally broken model of scholarly communication. But to just see the issue as one of the flow of information, the flow of knowledge, as if just making a blog available online means we are talking to and engaging with the public, is very limited, because actually I think a lot of academic social media ends up being consumed by other academics. There's lots of room for interdisciplinarity involved that is opened up by this, but it's still very limited. And so trying to examine the assumptions that I brought to my own practice as someone who ran academic blogs, the sociological imagination. I was the editor of the LSE's Politics and Policy blog for a period of time. And these are blogs with big audiences, which were in some ways public, but I felt there weren't the intellectual resources to think about what it means to talk about a blog as being public. Is it a case of it being in principle available without filters? Is it a case of whose views and positions are platformed on the blog? Is it a case of who the readership is? Is it a combination of all these things? And that's why we've argued that we need to rethink the relationship between public sociology and the media infrastructures that it uses. Because if we think about this historically, there's a certain apparatus of broadcast and print media, which, in broad brushstrokes, has been destabilized and expanded by the rise of new forms of digital social platforms. And in that sense, it's a really good time to not just think about social media, because the risk is that we get drawn in by the shock of the new. And it's really strange that we still talk about social media platforms in higher education as if they're new, whereas actually, they're 20 years old. Blogging has been around for a very long time now, and it's still seen as a kind of novel scholarly practice. And so, we have focused on digital platforms, but we try to make this argument about platforms more generally, infrastructures, socio-technical arrangements of parts that enable intellectual outputs to be made available to other people. And in that sense, we see social media platforms as just one kind of platform. And we try to talk about this in the book as the distinction between the legacy platforms of scholarship, which tended to fade into the background because things like journals and scholarly monographs are so familiar. We often didn't see them as media technologies, despite the fact they clearly are media technologies. And so what we tried not to do is to get into a valorization of the new and say social media is good because it's new, or conversely say social media is bad because it's new. But we try to use the emergence of social media as a means to instigate a conversation about how the relationship between sociology and its publics always relies on platforms to mediate the two. And we found it curious that platforms were a silent mediating partner. They were always there in the practice and theory of public sociology. And they were sometimes talked about as technical issues or as instrumental challenges, but there was no underlying conceptual engagement with them, that we never encountered the public in a purely direct, immediate fashion. It's always to some extent mediated. And so we try to unpack the nature of that mediation and offer a general theory of platforms and their significance for public sociology.
So
I mean,
the next question, you want to add something, Lambros?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add something to what Mark was saying, which is something we've discussed many times as well, and I think we've mentioned at relative length in the book, which is that we also see sociology itself as a technology for thinking about the social world, as well as making making public interventions, as well as making sense of public social life as well. So I particularly I'm very fond of that idea of sociological thinking as a technology for doing things and for doing public things, if I can put it this way.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in some ways what we're kind of gesturing towards is an agnosticism towards the type of platform to recognize these common features. And the part of our conversations I enjoyed the most were about recognizing assembly and gathering. So the way in which people come together. So we don't see publics pre-constituted, but we see publics in a kind of pragmatist tradition as nascent collectives which assemble, even if fleetingly, around particular kinds of things. And we're kind of gesturing towards a vision of public sociology as a practice of assembly, as a practice of designing and implementing assemblies and acting in public in a way that's orientated towards facilitating assembly.
All right. So coming back to this point that both of you had mentioned about public sociology not being just theorized, but also put into practice. So how do you think it can be put into practice? Do you have any insights?
I mean, I would probably be keen to stick to the example I gave in my first answer, which is that of Free University Brighton. But ultimately, and this is just an example, of course, right? It's not the only example, and it's not the best or only contribution to this. It's just the one that I'm mostly familiar with. But I guess ultimately, for me, public sociology can be put into practice by thinking about what interventions one can make in public, and how sociology can be used for that, as a tool. So it could be by organizing or setting up reading and discussion groups. It could be, building a community library project, building cooperatives to provide infrastructures for citizenship, based on one's research. So one could use one's research or the insights from one's research to make a public contribution, not by shouting this is public sociology or necessarily as a sociologist, but using that knowledge, using that expertise to make a public intervention and make a public difference. It could be through petitions, it could be through legal advice, it could be through literally creating communal infrastructures of care and welfare in the communities that we live in. So essentially what I'm saying is that one can put one's sharpened conscience actually about certain issues into practice by doing things in public to respond to the problems that one might spend the sociological lives thinking, writing, and teaching about. But I guess, as I say that, I'm also conscious of the fact that I don't want to be misinterpreted as saying that all public participation is public sociology, or that sociology is the only discipline that can contribute to participatory citizenship.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it's one that I felt uncomfortable about after we published the book. Because as a kind of biographical fact, I was in a sociology department when writing the book, as I think you were, Lambros. And now, you're in a criminology department, I'm in an education department. And, just that degree of distance from your own disciplinary training has sensitized me. And it might have been more obvious to others, but I've only really become completely aware of it in the last couple of years, of the point Lambros is making. And in that sense, I hope the book could be read as public sociology or anthropology or geography or criminology. And actually, it's about public scholarship in a platformized world. And as a kind of claim about intellectual history, Burrow-Wise interventions were so influential. And the emergence of public sociology at the time of heightened professionalization, it kickstarted, it instigated these trends in other disciplines to name this. But it is only naming it. It was always there in a nascent form. And it was naming it and theorizing it and articulating it and making it an object of conversation, making it something that we can gather around in the sense in which we're talking about. But the risk is that public sociology then becomes a kind of gathering assembly device that is only accessible to sociologists. Whereas the conversation we wanted to start, I really hope, is one that's accessible to people who aren't sociologists, but people who do scholarly work, who work in systematic ways to add to knowledge and are interested in the public relevance and public implications of that work and how to act in public ways and the challenges involved in doing so. That's the conversation I think we were gesturing towards. And it's a bit of a quirk of the time and place we happened to start the project that we framed it as public sociology.
Right. So, one of the final questions that we have today is something on public sociology and how it differs in the global South and global North, right? Like we are also here located, like the Ritupanna and I are located in the global South, and both of you in the global North. So we do have our own experiences of how public sociology is practiced, but we'd like to know from you both how do you think that public sociology differs in the global South from that in the global North? Yeah, Mark, you could begin.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that I've spent a lot of time reflecting on since we published the book. And I don't think, to be honest, we did an adequate job of considering this in the book. But in the sense in which we were trying to clear away some of the conceptual detritus in the public sociology debate, to try and identify and deal with some of the unhelpful assumptions, I hope we've cleared a space that can contribute to a better conversation in that respect, and a less Eurocentric conversation about public sociological practice. And I'm thinking particularly about what we talk about as the dissemination assumption, drawing on an interesting body of scholarship in public sociology that's been critical of Burawoy. And there's quite a few people who have developed this argument, and we try and run with it and think about it in relation to public sociology, of how Burawoy's conception of the relationship between the professional and the public led to a subordinate relationship where public sociology is a transmission of professional knowledge. And there's a developing current in the public sociology literature that I think we've contributed to now, which tries to provincialize that assumption and to try and recognize how this outlook of Burawoy was a product of a particular time and a particular place. And there's a lot more we could have done with this, and I wish we had explored this in greater depth. But I'm hoping that once we start to decenter professional sociology, it brings with it a destabilization of a whole system of hierarchies that have American professional sociology at the top of the hierarchy. And I hope we clear a space in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, I guess for me, it's, your question prompts thoughts about what economic, material, infrastructural means we have available to enable the practice of public sociology, and I guess sociology at large as well. But I think it also, in many ways, encourages a discussion on what political traditions of doing public sociology and public life there are. So, for example, public sociology as an academic practice in the UK and in the US, I should think, is very much tied to professionalization in a typically Euro-modern or Euro-Western manner. So in ways that might happen as a practice and an ethic, which might not have a name in other places, and no need for it to be touted or branded and sold as a thing, as a thing that needs to be called public sociology, that is somehow distinct from other forms of scholarship or public participation. So I guess to simplify that, without any intention to essentialize or generalize or stereotype here, the West may do public sociology in the form of conferences or special issue journals and publications, while examples of public knowledge taking place in other parts of the world might take different forms. So I'm thinking here for about an Indian example that I find particularly fascinating, which is, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Vayanashalas, which I understand are sort of reading halls in Kerala in particular, which also have a political function from what I understand. And that idea really does fascinate me, how sort of reading comes together with political action in public space and what that means. And I think these are the kinds of things that Mark and I really get excited about, and that's actually how the book came together. So it all depends on what kinds of public sociology we are referring to, and whether we are referring to its professional or professionalized dimension, or its more sort of public and publicly visible practice. And just one last thing, because I think it's important to note, is that we should also kind of explore the relationship between global South and global North as one where as one of recognition that actually there exist Southern or decolonial and anti-colonial traditions within the global North as well, that come very close to my own conception of public forms of making knowledge, which may not be sociological per se. So in the book, we give the example of outdoor grime music raves, for example, which which come from a very long tradition of Afro-diasporic culture that places a premium on free association, open assembly, and active participation. So rap performances to me are an example of public participatory culture that comes from the global south, but has migrated, taken root, and changed shape in the global north. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that such an understanding reminds us that there really isn't any global north that is not also the product of centuries of interactions between regions and cultures that span the globe. And unfortunately, largely due to the long disreputable and ignoble legacy of colonial slavery and colonial statecraft. So I've given a very long and convoluted answer, but these are kind of the thoughts that your really insightful question prompted.
And it's very interesting. I mean, at risk of stating the obvious, that we are having this conversation via Zoom, and there's a really difficult balance to be struck between recognizing the genuinely radical connective capacity of commercial digital platforms, and also taking a very naive view to them. And this is what the first parts of the book are trying to develop, of how we can adopt an appropriately cynical attitude towards these corporate platforms, while also recognizing the potential of them to connect, and the capacity of sociology to help us unpack the relationship between the basic connective capacity they offer, but then the kind of relations of power and inequality in terms of language, in terms of status, in terms of academic capital, and how these play themselves out in these online interactions. And I don't think we do reach any conclusive conclusion about that, but those aspects of our argument have felt relevant to me as we've lived through the COVID pandemic, and how that has reshaped working practices in different ways around the world, and also what that means for kind of international higher education and the equitable aspects which are opened up by opening up elite spaces in the global north in a way that is not contingent on international travel and negotiating ever more draconian visa restrictions. But conversely, we also need to recognize how these are not free, fair, open spaces digital capitalism creates, but are also riven with power and inequalities in new ways. And it's this aspect of what we did in the book that I've tried to take into my work on the post-pandemic university since then, to understand the kind of international context which we are living within in different ways. And I'm still at the early stages of making sense of that myself, but I'm hoping that work will also speak to the questions that you're raising as I get further into it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those enriching thoughts. And I hope this book becomes an important contribution in bridging the gap between practice and theory when we talk about public sociology, to sort of talk more about it. I think the point that you raised, that we were able to hold this interview, is primarily because of the availability of the platform Zoom, and the fact that we can communicate online, because probably in the pre-pandemic period, we wouldn't even think of hosting an interview or through a blog, which is completely non-funded and institutionally non-supported. So there is certain already steps that are being taken, and I feel that we can do much more, of course. Thank you both for the discussion, and we hope that our viewers go back and read the book. And in case any questions, they can also reach out to both authors who took time out of their busy schedules and different time zones to be with us. So thank you both, Mark and Lambros.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
Likewise, it was an absolute pleasure, and it's definitely the highlight of my day, if not my week. So thank you very, very much.
Those are like really kind words. Thank you so much.